Hello everybody, welcome back to Medieval Mondays. I apologize for my voice in advance. It's been a little croggy lately. So today we're going to talk about Edward I in preparation for his first crusade. Now the players in our story today are Charles, King of Sicily, who became the king by beheading his German rival. A story for another day, but not today. Louis, King of France, Louis IX, King of France. His son, Philip III, who was his successor to the crown. Edmund, Edward I's younger brother. Edward I, of course, this is about him, and Henry of Almaine, Edward's cousin. Now, last time we left up Edward, he was getting ready to embark on this expedition. It had been decided that he was going to go after much debate as to whether he should not, and they decided, okay, Edward, you can go on this crusade. He had one big problem that was stopping him, though: money. So the first desire that he did was his father proposed a national tax to get the crusade going. However, they had just fought the Civil War, and him proposing a national tax was one of the main things that got the war started in the first place. So it didn't seem like a good idea. Not too many people would be on board with it, and they would more than likely vote no against it. So Ottobuono, the man who had negotiated the peace between the Montfortians and between the royalists after Evesham, in the aftermath of Evesham, went to the Pope and advised the Pope that Edward was a man worthy of a grant of money to get the crusade going. So under his influence, the Pope decided to grant money to Edward to get it going. But the Pope died. And the cardinals of the college were more busy and more concerned with deciding who his successor would be than they were with sending any money to Edward. So strike two against Edward for trying to get the campaign going. His father, Henry, tried giving him some assistance by having all of his sheriffs and all of his justiciars increase the revenues on the local people. But this turned the hearts of the common people against the king more so, and they figured, well, if they're going to increase the money on us, next time, when the time comes for the voting of the national tax, they were more than likely going to vote no on that. So strike three against Edward. After that, Edward decided to write a legislation against the Jews to win the hearts of the people in his favor, so they would vote yes on the national tax. Now, I'm going to go into what that legislation was in more depth in a separate video. But for now, just know he was writing one against the Jews, and he had hoped that would get the people on his side in 1268, but it didn't kickstart anything, because the people had already seen previously legislations put out, but they weren't enforced thoroughly enough to be in their favor. So it didn't really move the hearts of the people towards Edward's desire. However, Edward still had a few other options to get money. His brother Edmund had just married a very wealthy heiress, and she was going to inherit a couple of isles, and she was also going to inherit lands in Yorkshire, so he could get money from there. Edmund was going to go on the crusade with Edward at this point, and so were both their wives. Eleanor was coming, and Edmund's wife was coming. The other thing they did, which is a bit more devious, was they seized the lands of a former Montfortian. He was Earl Robert Ferrers, and he was an enemy of Edward. They didn't like each other. They had clashed several times openly at the parliaments, and they had clashed during the Civil War back and forth, verbally mostly. And Edward knew he could take the land from the man, because during the dictum of Kenilworth, when all the Montfortians came forth and plead their case, and the king said, okay, you could have your land back, you have to pay this amount of money for this set amount of time until I'm satisfied, Robert didn't come forth and do that. So basically he had no case, and under duress, all his estates and all his lands were just taken from him right away, and they were transferred to Edmund, Edward's brother. Now, Henry was more concerned with continuing to build the church at Westminster Abbey than he was getting the crusade going necessarily. He had not granted any of his personal wealth towards Edward to get the crusade going, and all the knights of the Shire still refused to subsidize the campaign, and most of the Montfortians who had been disinherited then got their land back, then had to pay this separate fine on their lands for a set amount of time, were so disgruntled about it, many of them refused to even go on the campaign. So it was looking pretty bleak for Edward. But in 1270, the following year, in May, Henry the King finally put in force the legislation that Edward had passed the previous year. And by doing so, he curved a lot of the issues that were going on with the Jewish money lending. And like I said, that's going to be a video for a separate day because it's a whole lot to go in, and this video is already too long anyway. That was enough to get the people to vote yes on the national tax. So at last, finally, Edward's getting in. He's going to be bringing in a lot more money than he needed. From his personal revenue, he did have 7 royal castles, 8 counties, and the city of London from which he could bring in revenue. But now there was a national tax that was going to be specifically for this crusade. So the only problem he had left now was to show up on time at the rendezvous with Louis to get going. The crusade had been dragging its feet in England. It was moving with extremely fast momentum in France. So Edward had to catch up, literally. First, he went to Portsmouth and was preparing to set sail to France, and then march down to meet Louis at a port in the Mediterranean. However, on August 4th, when he arrived, there was the weather was bad, and they said we can't set sail yet. So they had to wait. They wound up not departing until August 20th. Then they arrived in France, and the plan was for Edward to march through Gascony and gather additional resources and men with him. He had 225 knights with him, and they also had a whole bunch of cooks. They had clerks. They had servants. They brought a whole bunch of other stuff with them. So it was about 1,000 plus people who were marching. And the plan was to stop at Gascony and gather more men, more weapons, and more provisions. However, they had to abandon this because they were already behind on the time for marching forward. So instead, they went straight. They did a 600-mile trek in the space of a month to go and meet Louis. And so they arrived at this place. Louis was not there. Louis had already left way back in July. And the reason for this was his men had been there waiting for Edward, and they began to eat up a lot of the food. And he didn't want to have to resupply all these storage places, so he said, okay, let's get moving. You know, Edward has been dragging his feet too much. We're going to get going. So they left, but the problem was they didn't head to the Holy Land like they originally planned. Instead, they went to North Africa. And this was because Charles of Anjou, who was the king of Sicily at this point, a seat that Henry III actually desired to hold, but Charles succeeded in taking it by beheading his German rival. Very interesting character, but that's a story for another day. But he had convinced Louis to go to North Africa instead. And the reason why was Charles wanted to expand his own empire by fighting against the Muslims in North Africa. I mean, we're going to Crusade. We're here to expand and gain some wealth. So, why not do something that'll help us? So he convinced him to go. So Edward said, okay, well, there's no point in not going and not following. So in October, they decided to follow in Louis's footsteps, or water steps, I guess. And they set sail and went to North Africa. And they arrived, and the meeting with Louis would never happen because Louis had died August 25th. What happened was when they arrived in North Africa, plague swept through the French army, killed hundreds of soldiers, killed Louis's other son, not Philip III, the one who would succeed him, killed his son, and he died from plague. So while all that was going on, and while Edward is sailing there, Charles, king of Sicily, negotiates his deals with the emir and the sultan of that area. So he says, there's no need for me to continue hostilities. So by the time Edward shows up, the African adventure and basically the French involvement in the crusade was over at this point. And Charles invites Edward to come back to Sicily and decide what he wants to do next, if he wants to do anything at all. So they set sail back to Sicily, and on the way back, the French docked their fleet at one area, and Edward anchored his fleet in another area. And a terrible storm sweeps through and utterly wrecks the French fleet. Several men died in the wreck, a lot of supplies were lost, and a large amount of treasure they had been carrying with them was lost as well. So the French feel that this expedition is cursed by this point. The king has died, soldiers have died from plague, they've barely done any fighting with the enemy at all, and they've already lost too much. So Philip III decides, we're going to head back home. We're abandoning the crusade. Edward, however, was not at all hurt during the terrible storm that swept through. His fleet was fine. So while the French looked at it as cursed, the English looked at it as, oh, well, God's blessing us because he protected us from the storm so we can keep on marching in our direction. And so because of that, Edward decided to continue on anyway with his campaign, but he didn't want to be left in the bad with the French, like, okay, you go head back on your own. He sent Henry of Almaine, his cousin, with Philip back to France so he can strengthen the bond between the families while he's gone back. So finally, in the spring of 1271, after wintering in Sicily, Edward set sail at last for his crusade into the Holy Land.